In 1997, the city of Mentor purchased what we now know as the Mentor Lagoons Nature Preserve and Marina with the intent of protecting and providing public access to this beautiful natural asset. Thanks to restoration work led by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, the adjoining Mentor Marsh is experiencing what is in many ways a renaissance, with the resurgence of native species in and around the marsh basin. Our own team of specialists do their part to care for natural spaces throughout the city through the active management of a variety of programs. We met up with City Naturalist Sam O'Connell to talk about the importance of biodiversity, as well as get some tips to find out what all of us can do to help make Mentor a little more green. So we're standing in the middle of a butterfly prairie that you guys had planted years ago, and it seems to have taken root, and we got a lot of diversity going on here. Tell us about what we've got going on here.
So yeah, this is a butterfly prairie, or just a prairie in general. Basically, it's a collection of herbaceous plants that sort of succeeds through different types throughout the season. So right now it's primarily sennas, goldenrods, coneflowers, and asters. And the benefit that successional aspect provides is different insects come out at different times of the year. Different birds are here at different times of the year, different wildlife. So this shift kind of follows the trend of what those animals need. And in that way, it's an incredible stopover point.
So, I mean, all the flowers and stuff that come up here, they come up at different times during the season?
As the season progresses, yeah, different things take hold. So earlier in the season, it's a lot shorter vegetation. Right now, it's primarily, like I said, grasses, sennas, goldenrods, and coneflowers and asters. Mm-hmm. But earlier in the season, you can expect to see things like mountain mint, which is a fantastic pollinator plant.
Milkweed was considered a noxious plant in Mentor for a very, very long time, right? And then all of a sudden we have a problem because we don't have any more monarchs because that's the only plant they feed on, right?
Right. There has been a big push for additional plantings of milkweed. I know that in the collective of society, that's been something that a lot of people have become more and more aware about as time has progressed. There's been a lot of really good campaigns. And actually, I think there's an initiative right now to put little trackers on monarchs that will be migrating so that we can kind of get a better feel for what the populations are like from this area and other areas in the state.
It's not just monarchs, we've got other kinds of butterflies that come through here. I mean, is there a diverse population, or are these things kind of come through seasonally, or?
There's a little bit of seasonal variation to it, absolutely, but a large diversity. You know, I've probably seen 100 species of butterflies out here, and when you start to roll in moths, that number just absolutely explodes.
And this is growth over the years, I'm sure. I mean, what you've experienced since you've been with the city.
Yeah, I personally have documented about 1,000 species in the city of Mentor alone this year. You know, 200 to 300 species of plants, probably 600 species of insects, 150 species of birds, and we can only expect that number to continue to go up.
Talk about some of the insects that you're seeing out there. I mean, you know, most of us really don't realize. We're like, oh yeah, it's a bug, it's a bee, it's a butterfly. Talk about some of the diversity. I mean, what are you seeing that's unusual?
Sure. Something a lot of people don't really consider is that, you know, you think of bees as pollinators, and that's kind of your primary thought, you know, big fuzzy bumblebees. What a lot of people don't realize or see is tons of other species of insects are pollinators. I mean, there are sweat bees, which are a bee, but they look nothing like it. They look like a common housefly. But flies are also incredibly valuable pollinators. Wasps are incredibly valuable pollinators. There's probably 40, 50 species of wasps just hanging out right around us in this immediate vicinity. And hornets even. I mean, people think of hornets as a nuisance. Oh no, they're gonna sting me, right? That's not really the case though. In areas like this, they're not defending their hive or their colony. They're out here looking for food, and they're providing an incredibly valuable resource. They're taking that pollen and bringing it somewhere else with them and helping to proliferate some of these high quality and you know, significant species that we have.
So tell us about some of these other critters that are probably running around in here. You know, when we had a monoculture in the marsh over there, you know, all you had was Phragmites. Talk to us about what the diversity of flora out there has now basically caused in terms of other species.
Sure. So these prairies and the lagoons in general and the restoration of the marsh by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History has brought in tons of different species. I mean, in this prairie, we get meadow voles, lots of different kinds of frogs and snakes. And this is also phenomenal habitat for birds, and especially the migrating ones. This is a perfect spot for them to stop and pick up some quick fuel for their long trek down south. And this area is phenomenal for coyotes, raccoons, skunks, squirrels, chipmunks. The deer love it here as well.
With the reduction of the deer population, they're not grazing everything to oblivion. So talk about how keeping that in balance has basically helped everything else proliferate here.
Sure. So by balancing the population of deer within the city, we've decreased pressure on a lot of the vulnerable native species that we get, in particular what we consider to be spring ephemerals, which are the wildflowers that start to pop up first at the very beginning of the year. And those love the forest floor effectively. And those happen to be one of those plants that deer just love to chow down on. So something like a trillium. We're starting to see a big bounce back of those species. Now when you walk through the Mentor Lagoons Nature Preserve in the spring, we're actually one of the top hotspots for those spring ephemeral species. Whereas 10 years ago, you stood zero chance of seeing any of those wonderful, wonderful colors.
This is true. 10 years ago, you could have seen right through the forest floor because all the ground, foliage was actually absolutely gone. So people are starting to rediscover the importance of rain gardens and bringing some of these native species back in the yard, getting rid of the hostas and bringing in some native stuff. What's some of the stuff we could bring into our backyards and make it better?
Oh, mountain mint is an incredible pollinator plant. It grows probably yay high with big bushy white flowers, and the amount of insects and bugs in general that you can find on it is just absolutely off the charts. It's one of those plants that everything seems to love, and you'll pull insects in from all over the place. Another great one, especially for late season, is goldenrod. As the season goes on, there tends to be less food available for insects and pollinators in particular. So planting a species that have that seasonal succession to them is incredibly valuable, and you're doing more good than you ever would just by planting a single species plant like just mountain mint. You need some of that succession, so goldenrods, coneflowers, asters.
What other plants would you want to plant in your backyard in order to attract birds?
Oh, things like native thistles, fruit-bearing trees and shrubs are another great option, and those double to provide structuring and protection for bird species. Obviously, being a small bird, whether you're ground foraging or eating from a feeder, you always have to be on the lookout for predators. So that's one of those things you can really do to make your yard more enjoyable and palatable to bird species. And I'm sure if you just you go to your favorite search engine and you type in some of these plants that we're talking about, there's a bunch of resources for it. You could also contact us at the city, and we'd be happy to direct you to some options.
So we talked about diversity here at the marsh. We talked about diversity at our parks. We talked about plants, insects. Let's talk about animals. How do you skunk-proof your yard, for example? How do you keep skunks out of your yard?
Sure. So it's an incredibly common question. How do we keep skunks out of our yards? How do we keep raccoons out of our yards? In most ways, skunks and raccoons are not ideal in an urban setting. They're disease vectors. Like you get your dog vaccinated for rabies or distemper. Raccoons are a vector for canine distemper and rabies as well. Things like foxes, mink, as we mentioned, squirrels, those all provide a relative benefit to the ecology of an urban landscape. But skunks and raccoons, they have some purpose, but like I said, in an urban area, they tend to create more nuisance situations and more hazardous situations than they solve problems. Some of the most basic things you can do is to make your yard as undesirable to these species as possible. So a very common thing that people have around their homes is bird feeders. Well, you don't typically see people cleaning up underneath their bird feeders. However, when you don't do that, you're basically providing an area for insects and other resources that these skunks and raccoons look for. So you're enticing them to come to your yard. Other common things are, securing trash can lids, making sure you're not leaving pet food and water outside. Motion detecting lights. If you've got a big enough issue, you can always look into motion detecting sprinklers. That's usually enough to keep an animal from coming back. Another common issue is animals will dig under, porches or decks or sheds, making sure those are filled back in. It's not enough to just fill those holes back in, however. You need to get something like a chicken wire and lay that down over the opening of the hole and then fill it. Because they're just going to dig that right back out. They can smell that this is where I've been. They want to get right back to where they were. So dirt is not enough alone. Putting a heavy rock on top of it is also another option that a lot of people have.
Why do they dig under porches?
It's great protective shelter. Where better to spend your days than right next to a human habitat where a lot of your predators aren't going to be coming around. There's abundant food resources, water. It's perfectly sheltered. You don't have to worry about any of those kind of seasonal variations that you would get if you were living out in the middle of the forest.
If I was a skunk and I didn't have a garbage bag to go pick through, or that's probably more proper for a raccoon, but I mean, basically, what does a skunk eat?
Typically grubs and insects, so they'll root around like in your sunflower seed castings that need to be cleaned up. They'll root around in that, and they find these insects, these grubs, and that's one of their primary food sources.
Coyotes. When does activity start kicking up here?
Coyotes will start doing more foraging as the winter starts to set in, fall, winter season. Typically though, the peak time for sightings of coyotes and actually the times where they create the most issues in terms of their foraging behavior is pup season or just before pup season. So that'll be March, April-ish. You'll start to see a lot of them, and then they'll disappear for a little while, and then once they have their pups, you'll start to see them move around more and more then. Because obviously they need to find that additional food to feed more mouths. So that's typically the time of year you have a lot of the human-wildlife interaction side of coyotes come up. And then typically by September, you start to see a lot less of them because their pups are going off to hold their own territories and they're not coming into contact with people quite as often at that point.
If anybody had any questions regarding natural resources in the city of Mentor, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, if you have any questions regarding wildlife, native plantings, anything to do with natural resources, you can always give us a call at our office, 440-974-5717, or go ahead and email parks@cityofmentor.com.